Welcome back to Cinematic. I'm Ryan. I've got a little bit of housekeeping to do up front here, so if you need to, skip ahead a minute, but I promise it has everything to do with the movie I'm talking about today. So sometimes I go through this letterboxed list of mine that I'm making my way through, and I think maybe I should cull some of these 140 plus movies, 64 of which I have seen. So it's not that I'm not making some progress as slowly as it might be. But I came up with two answers to that this time around. The first thing is something I've really already been doing, maybe unconsciously or overtly actually, is that I'm going to keep it focused on Hong Kong action. And part of the reason I'm talking about this is because we've been on the verge for months now of kind of breaking into some of what the United States was releasing in the 80s and 90s. So I'm just going to keep it focused. Like if I can draw a dotted line to Hong Kong action in any way, whether it's an actor or a choreographer or whatever it might be, that's what I'm going to do. Maybe call it out a little bit more. So thing number one. Thing number two, which is pretty much born right out of number one, is that if I'm going to keep talking about Hong Kong action, especially as it bridges the gap between Hong Kong and the United States, I feel like there are at the very least, again, this list is incomplete by nature, but at the very least, two directors that are not represented well enough by a mile, and that's John Woo and Ringo Lam. So we're going to go all the way back to 1979 this week, the year of my birth, and talk about Last Hurrah for Chivalry, which is an objectively good title for a movie no matter what, and one that was written and directed by John Woo. So anytime that happens, I see written and directed by, kind of the alarm bells start going off, because there's this thing, I feel like I mentioned it here and there, you probably even heard about it, it's pretty widely known, the auteur theory, this idea that certain directors have kind of indelible fingerprints, or you can always tell it's one of their movies. Also, movies are an incredibly collaborative process. We've all seen the credits, etc., etc. So a little bit of controversy or whatever, but I feel like if we're talking about written and directed by, there's maybe a little bit more of an argument there, something to see in terms of that. So I'm kind of on the lookout for a John Woo movie during this thing to see, even though it is a wuxia, or born out of that, it takes place in ancient China. It's not what I would, I know John Woo from his American stuff. I know Face Off, I know other movies besides Face Off, Mission Impossible, whatever, I know the stuff from John Woo after he came to the States, even though I knew from whatever, that he also had kind of Western sensibilities about him. So that's something I'm on the lookout for. But also, anytime I see written and directed by, I'm always like, how did that come about? Because that's not, I feel like unless you're going guerrilla, you're doing it all on your own, whatever. It's not something that a studio lets you do unless you've got some track record behind you. So I went to check out John Woo's track record, which I didn't know about. Turns out he was Cheng Che's assistant director for years. And when he did start directing his own stuff, it just straight up did well. So he kept getting opportunities. In fact, the easy answer to how he was both able to write and direct Last Hurrah for Chivalry is that he wrote and directed 7 times before this. So this is coming a little bit later, but it's also apparently the movie that kind of came before his heroic bloodshed stuff, which was a term that I think it was one that a reviewer came up with that stuck. Rick Baker in the magazine Eastern Heroes in the late 1980s is where that comes from. So the other reason I chose Last Hurrah is because it doesn't quite fit the mold, honestly. It does make sense that Golden Harvest would put it out. Kind of their rhetoric was that they were giving more creative freedom and possibly experimenting a little bit more than Shaw Brothers, that had a very centralized studio system thing going. But I could see John Woo pitching this to, Raymond Chow or whoever, and them hesitating just to like, okay, that's different, or we'll see, or however it went. Again, by this point, John Woo had a track record, so he probably wasn't going to get a no, and they probably were going to trust him at least a little bit. But the story, it's a bit complicated. Honestly, I think I did it the wrong way, which was I watched this in like 3 parts just because scheduling and all that. If you're going to watch it, get the first hour out of the way, just all in one sitting would be my advice. But in the interest of that, let me see if I can get this all in one for you. So we open up on Lord Ko Pong's wedding party to a reformed prostitute but it turns out not so reformed because she betrays him in the middle because she's in league with the big bad Pak Chung Tung, which I promise I'm not overpronouncing that. They just really spit it out in this one and I love it. Lord Ko barely escapes with his life, wants revenge immediately, but his Sifu tells him that he's not up to the task and recommends Wai Pak's character, Chong Song the Divine Blade, to enact his revenge. Cut to him defending some kids from a bully, so he's a hero. But Fung Ha Kan's character, Pray or Let It Be, has other ideas, challenges Chong Song to a duel, but rather than take up a sword, Chong Song retreats, so something's going on there. But Lord Ko witnesses the whole thing, so he tries to hire Fung Ha Kan's character for, I don't know, but cut to another swordsman played by Damien Lau, and he's kind of a drunken master, drunken mercenary, probably more like, that is in the middle of rescuing a criminal who double crosses him and doesn't pay him in the end. Chong Song sees him being pursued by the cops and then helps him escape, so they become friends. And those are the two swordsmen that we basically follow throughout the movie. But turns out Lord Ko did hire Fung Ha Kan to kill his own Sifu and all of his students. So when Lord Ko's new friend Chong Song finds out, he's animated against Pak Chung Tung, which is just what Lord Ko wanted. But meanwhile, Ching Yi is out in one of Pak Chung Tung's gambling dens where he's been cheated. So he's mad at Pak Chung Tung too, but that's more of a bonus because as Chong Song is willing to take revenge on Pak Chung Tung for Lord Ko, obviously his also new friend Xing Ying is not going to let him do that alone. And that'll get you about halfway through the movie. I'm not joking, that's about an hour's worth of material because the last act itself is about 50 minutes. But guess what that sounds like? To me, sounds like a John Woo movie. I mean, Face Off is popcorn through and through, but Mission Impossible, heaven knows that sounds like a plot from Mission Impossible 2. But the twists and the turns and the double crosses, all that sounds super familiar. Even if I'm not quite sure this particular movie meets its ambition in that way, I do still think it's punching above its weight, let's say. And a lot of that does come from the last act, actually. But before we get there, I need to go back because Fung Ha Kan is in this, like I mentioned, and he's been in a million things, 207 things actually, to be exact. As far as this series goes, I've seen him in Spiritual Boxer, Snake in the Eagle's Shadow, Enter the Fat Dragon. I think was when I first started to recognize him from other stuff and be like, oh, he's showing up a lot. And by that point, I think he had reached full-on bad guy typecast. So he also showed up in Warriors 2 as one of those. But again, 207 acting credits to his name, according to the Hong Kong Movie Database, before he passes away in 2016. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time on him because not only did he become an official member of the Jackie Chan stunt team, yeah, he was on the team by this point in 1979, but he is the martial arts director for Last Hurrah. And it's really good. Surprisingly, the fights that he himself is in, I think might be the best, but that's maybe discounting, again, the last act, which is fantastic. And that's at least in part because of the setup that comes directly before it. It's got strong heist movie vibes. You know, think about Ocean's 11 where they spend, before the third act hops off, they spend a good, it seems like 5-10 minutes just talking about the plan, the parts that they're willing to tell you anyways, and cutting to how it might go down or how it actually went down or whatever. In this case, Ching Ying is counting down all of the bad guys they're going to have to make their way through, like Yellow Weasel and Phantom Spear, Spirit Reaper, and Mad Blade of the Sleeping Buddha. And then, of course, Pak Chung Tung himself. But as he's describing all of their different techniques, it cuts to, shots of them enacting these on inanimate objects in a way that you're like, that shouldn't be a person. And then later is, which this might be the other John Woo about this movie, is that a little bit bloodier than maybe we've seen so far. That the bloodshed part of the heroic bloodshed, even though this is considered a precursor or whatever, is in this one. It's not super gory. There's just more blood and there's a bit of the spurting, if you've ever seen that in some of the Kung Fu classics. Got a little bit of that in this one. So after that, the third act does kick off. It is great. The choreography is fantastic and inventive and super fun. Cinematically, it's gorgeous. They put all of they're kind of in like ninja costumes, but you know, or whatever. They're all white. In fact, the heroes are in white too. So you can imagine how that might look against a bloody battle of sorts. Very good. There's lots of slow-mo, which I didn't mention also in terms of, you know, is this a John Woo movie or not? We are about 4 minutes into the movie before there's a really gorgeous slow-mo shot. No doves, but a very pretty slow-mo shot, and that is just amped up in the third act during all the fight scenes. I think it's just this side of being gratuitous, but on purpose. And I think that's kind of the point. We're going to be a little flashy, but it earns it, and it totally pulls it off. There's a straight-up cage match in the middle, and all told, again, it's about 50 minutes long. The twists and turns aren't quite over, so it goes places. Even in the final fight, ends up being with Lord Ko, who we've established can't really fight on his own, isn't up to the task. He gets a hold of the Moon Shadow Sword, which belonged to his Sifu, and that gives him some otherworldly powers, actually, which were real fun to watch and proved a directing challenge of sorts. To hear John Woo talk about it, you can go, there's an extra that's on YouTube that you can watch where he talks about how, number one, this was basically a tribute to Chang Che. In fact, I believe he made it at least in part at the behest of Chang Che, who had some of the ideas involved in it, or he had consulted with in some way. And that's probably no more apparent than it is in the third act. So a lot of fun. Last hurrah for Chivalry. I really wanted to see what John Woo did before he did, you know, like the hard-boiled stuff, the real typical heroic bloodshed stuff. So I'm glad we went there. Before we go all the way there, I believe Ringo Lam's gonna get a shot. In 1986 with Aces Go Places 4, or I think Mad Mission 4, depending. There's a small chance, because strangely enough, John Woo actually had a lot of success with his Kung Fu comedies also, apparently. There's a small chance I get a hold of Run Tiger Run and we do a John Woo Kung Fu comedy. I think more likely than not, we're going to go with Aces Go Places 4 or Mad Mission 4. So come back next week for that. Thanks for hanging out for this. As always, you can find me at patreon.com/Ryan_runs_, or there's a PayPal link not far from where you're at. All of this stuff helps me continue to do this stuff. Otherwise, watching, liking, and subscribing is just fantastic, and I love it a lot. So thank you regardless.